Okay, just imagine this for a second. You're in prison. Your future is a total question mark, and you're facing a trial that could literally end your life. Well, that was the reality for the Apostle Paul. But how he responded, well, it's both shocking and incredibly profound. Let's dive into the amazing purpose Paul found right in the middle of his deepest suffering and see what we can learn from it. And this really brings us to a huge question, one that Paul's life kind of forces us to ask ourselves. What could possibly be more important than our own freedom, or even just our own well-being? For Paul, believe it or not, the answer was totally clear. You see, from his own letters, specifically to the Philippians, Paul makes it obvious that his ultimate hope wasn't just about getting out of jail. No, his deepest desire, the thing that drove him, was that Christ would be honored and magnified right in the middle of his mess. It didn't matter if he lived or died. It was never really about him. Now, to really feel the weight of that hope, we have to understand the incredible scale of suffering that basically defined Paul's life. I mean, this was not his first time in chains, not by a long shot. In fact, his imprisonment in Rome, that was just another chapter in a long, long story of hardship he went through for his faith. It was the pattern of his life, not some random, unlucky event. So in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul just casually drops this staggering resume of suffering. We're talking about being in prison all the time, beaten beyond measure, shipwrecked 3 times, and oh yeah, stoned once. He was constantly in danger, hungry, cold. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the brutal, day-in, day-out reality of his mission. The toll on him must have been unimaginable, which makes what he actually cared about even more shocking. So after hearing that insane list, you gotta ask, right? With all that going on, what could possibly have been his main concern? What was keeping him up at night? Well, the answer is probably not what you'd expect. In fact, Paul himself tells us that this whole laundry list of beatings, shipwrecks, and dangers, that wasn't even the heaviest thing on his mind. He basically says, yeah, that was bad, but it wasn't the main thing. And right here, he reveals it. This was his true burden. He says his daily pressure, the overwhelming thing he worried about, was the well-being of all the churches. Not his own safety, not where his next meal was coming from, but the spiritual health of these communities he'd started. And listen, this wasn't some kind of detached administrative concern, like a CEO looking at a spreadsheet. No, this was a deeply personal, fatherly responsibility. Paul felt connected to these believers like a parent to a child. He would have sacrificed absolutely everything for them. That was his real burden. So this focus on others leads us to this really fascinating paradox. You'd think that dedicating your life to God would lead to, peace and quiet, right? But for Paul, it was the exact opposite. Paul actually explains this himself in his letter to Timothy. He just states it like it's a fact of life. If you want to live a godly life, you will face persecution. For him, opposition wasn't a sign he was doing something wrong. A lot of the time, it was a sign he was on the right track. So here's that paradox in action. On one side, you try to live a life that honors God, and that can actually bring on rejection and hardship. But, and here's the amazing part, on the other side, that very same suffering becomes this incredibly powerful testimony. It's a witness that glorifies God because it shows a faith that's real, a faith that doesn't just crumble when things get tough. This quote just nails it, doesn't it? It wasn't just the words Paul said that mattered. It was his character while he was being unjustly imprisoned, his patience, his joy, his courage, his unshakable faith. That became a living, breathing sermon that preached the gospel way more powerfully than words alone ever could. And this is where the whole story comes right back to us, to our lives today. Paul's example isn't just some old story. It's like a mirror held up to our own lives and how we respond when things get hard. So the challenge for us is to really think about our own actions. How do we live our lives? How do we treat people, especially the ones who are difficult, the people who push back against us, or who just don't treat us well? How we react in those moments, well, that's our witness. And that leaves us with this final, powerful question to really chew on. When people look at how you handle pressure, or disagreement, or just plain old hardship, what story does it tell? What kind of testimony is your life for the things you say you believe?